Hello, everyone. This is Jeremy Dennis, lead artist of Ma's House, hosting today's podcast. I'm joined by Qiaira Riley, who is the current Ma's House resident artist for September 2024. Qiaira is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, guerilla, art theorist, and Sagittarius, raised on Chicago's South Side and based in Philadelphia. She holds a dual BA in Black Studies and Studio Art from Lake Forest College, as well as an M.F.A. in Socially Engaged Studio Art from Moore College of Art and Design. She is a co-founder and curator of 2.0, a collective collaborating with artists and organizations to curate free, experimental offerings for Black women and femmes. Her art practice shifts between painting, ceramics, video, and printmaking. Her work explores and is inspired by Black archival practices, foodways, vernacular interiors, collective memories, virtual diasporic identity, and reality television. She hosts Something You Can Feel, a contemporary Black art history podcast that can be found on Apple and Spotify. So, Qiaira, welcome to the Ma's House podcast.
Thank you.
Have you been enjoying your time here at Ma's House?
It's been a really nice time. It's been kind of like a little retreat away from real life in a way. It's also nice to be outside of the city and just out in nature.
That's wonderful. Some things you might have to repeat for people who are listening on the podcast. You gave a in-person artist talk last week.
Yeah.
So some things I'll ask you about, and then people can look forward to seeing that on YouTube later.
Okay, cool.
But I wanted to start with asking, what projects have you been working on here at Ma's House?
No random things. I was doing this project called Beauty of the Week, inspired by Jet Magazine. Jet Magazine was a magazine that started in the 40s, really popular Black American magazine, and as a part of their work, they had a segment called Beauty of the Week, which was usually like the lady and a bikini and like a little paragraph about herself. I was really interested in that as a kid. I've been doing a bunch of cyanotypes inspired by that. Because I found them usually at my grandma's house, and I feel like a lot of people find them at their grandma's house, I was inspired to combine those images with images from my own family photo archives. I've been playing with the idea of collective memory through cyanotypes. I've been here. I've been making a lot of cyanotypes and I have lots of scraps of different ones. So I've started this quilting thing. I've been working on a painting. And then I've been also working on the zine called Chic in the Table, which is tying different performances of Black gendered deviants and reality TV with depictions of deviants from art history. So it's what I'm working on. And just kind of...
That's awesome. It sounds like you've been doing a lot of research and preparing, well, it sounds like TV shows and some physical archive.
Yeah, yeah.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned your grandmother earlier. Were there any pivotal memories from your times together that affected your art?
There's a lot of art programs in Chicago, but there's this one called the Beverly Art Center that is maybe a 20-minute drive from my grandma's house. She signed me up for classes there a lot in my preteen years. And so I would spend the weekends at her house, and she would just drive me to and from art classes. And I would go to different art centers a lot with my grandma for the weekend. She also gave me these creative girl kits. They were like these, I don't know how to describe them, but they were like mail-in like kits that would be like full of art supplies, and they would give you instructions on how to do something. I would never follow the instructions, and she'd always help me create stuff from these kits. Lots of arts and culture experiences and traveling a lot. We would travel a lot together growing up during breaks from school.
That's awesome. I was going to ask you a couple of things from your artist talk as well in reference to that. You mentioned that one of your cyanotypes was gifted to your grandmother, and she had a mixed reaction.
Yeah.
I wonder what, in the first place, drew you to cyanotype as a process and how you changed your approach ever since that reaction.
The first time I did cyanotypes, I was in grad school. I was getting my M.F.A. and there was this course where we were experimenting with different materials. One of those was cyanotypes, and I thought it was cool that it was a process that you had to do. Initially, when I discovered it, I thought you had to do it out in the sun every time. So I thought it was inherently just like a community process or like a public, it felt like a performance piece to have to go outside and expose something. I live in an apartment, and I've always lived in an apartment, so I don't have access to outdoor space that is private. And so having to publicly go out in the sun and expose always felt like a public thing anyway. I got really into just doing it. I don't really like to be watched while I'm making art, but I think cyanotypes has trained me to accept it. And I like the kind of interactions you get with people when they're asking, like, what are you doing? Or like, what's happening here? It's kind of fun for me. So I think I got really into the notion of like the sun is helping this process evolve. And that inherently is like the sun is a community thing that brings people together in this kind of funny way for art. I thought that was really interesting. Wait, what's the question again?
I was just wondering like how you got into cyanotype, and after you did the gift for your grandmother, did he change the way you started cyanotypes or like expose or design them?
I think when I first started doing cyanotype, the way I do the process is that I use transparencies printed on acetate. If you want it to look like a photo, you have to print out the negative. But I didn't know that initially. I was printing out the positive of everything on transparencies, and I would always get the negative when I did it on cyanotypes, which gives this kind of ghostly effect people have different reactions to. My grandma's reaction was like, I don't like it, it's too high contrast. I think I reminded her too much of a weird print, like an Andy Warhol type print, in a way that she was like, I don't want my image to be played with like that, I guess. But I think since then I have used more negatives on acetate to do cyanotypes. I have stepped away a little bit from how ghostly they look when you do the inverted version of it. And I kind of like when it shows up as more of a clear positive photo. Yeah.
And I did want to go back to the public engagement part of cyanotype, just because as a photographer, that was the one thing that helped me make friends and meet random people. So did you meet so many people in the public that you just became a cyanotype teacher, or how did that transition go from like being private and then actually teaching? I
think I started teaching cyanotype workshops when I was doing the Beauty of the Week project. As a part of the residency, I asked for a public program, but I thought it would be cool to do multiples across the city to get different neighborhoods vibes. I wanted to get different energies around the project and different thoughts about the project. And so I think it went from personal practice to teaching practice when also I would post on Instagram like, oh, look, I'm like doing a print, and people would be like, how do you do that? I want to try it out on my clothes. I have a lot of friends that work in textile, so they'd be like, ooh, I want to try this out on a dress or a t-shirt or something like that. And then started doing workshops, and then more people asked for workshops, and then it just turned into a thing where people associated me with cyanotypes in Jet magazine, and they would just ask me to come and do workshops. I think through doing the cyanotype workshops, I taught people how to do the process, and then people would come back to me having experimented with it on their own. And so you kind of build community that way. I met other people who are like been doing cyanotypes for a really long time and just want to see other people's processes.
Well, I did want to ask you about the images from the Jet magazine. I was going to ask how that entered into your practice, and I think that you mentioned collective and individual memory. During your artist talk, many people responded passionately and had immediate connections. What was your connection, especially as a young person and Jet being discontinued?
Jet started in Chicago. I feel like a lot of Black people in Chicago, particularly on the South Side, have a lot of affinity for Jet magazine and like Essence and Ebony and generally things associated with the Johnson Publishing Company. And so I just grew up with them being kind of everywhere. Like every time you went to an grandma's or an auntie's house, people would have like huge stacks of Jet magazine, and I always like to kind of peruse people's magazines. I guess I'm an only child, and I was also an only grandchild for 17 years. So I guess there just wasn't other kids around, and it was easy for me to get lost doing random things around adults' houses when they weren't paying attention to me. So I feel like magazines was a really interesting hobby of mine as a kid. I really liked flipping through adult magazines. Jet was interesting because it had informative articles about beauty, lifestyle, history, sports, all related to Black people. I just thought that was cool. The beauty of the week was interesting to me. I was always interested in like sexy women, I guess, or just like portrayal of like sexy Black women. I think it's a really interesting portrayal of femininity and like video vixens or women in bikinis who are pretty. I think it's just a really interesting depiction of femininity that I was always attracted to or interested in growing up. But what does this mean for my own adulthood and who I will be in the future? So I think I was always really intrigued by those images and kind of fantasized or dreamed about what I'd be like if I was one of those women. And so I was always really interested in them. And my grandma just had huge collection of Jet, and so does my aunt. She keeps it all in my mom's basement, and my mom's always really grumpy about it, like, please get all these magazines out of my basement. But I think they're super treasurable items.
Well, I find it so fascinating that growing up you had all these magazines and spent so much time with them, and now you're publishing your own zines. I wonder if you ever thought of going beyond that in terms of creating your own beauty of the week and having that connection with Jet magazine, like some of their columns or what they were talking about in your publication.
Yeah, I think I've always wanted to. When I was a kid, I thought I'd grow up and work at a magazine, and then magazines became defunct. So I'm always like playing with the idea of like, how do I recreate magazines but in a more interesting format. I'm doing this project right now where I'm trying to find, so the beauty of the weeks were mostly just like random women. You could submit your photo and information about yourself pretty easily. A lot of them were just young girls who were college age submitting their photos. So it's kind of not hard to stumble upon a woman who's like, oh, I was a Jet Beauty of the Week from the internet or something like that. So I'm trying to find them and interview them. I want to build some kind of archive once I compile all these interviews. What's an interesting magazine-like way to do that that's reminiscent of a Jet, but also trying to make that digital in some ways is hard, I think.
That sounds like a wonderful project, and your theme of research with people around the country. I'm looking forward to that project when you're working on it.
Me too.
I was going to ask you this next question. Your work appears to have strong representations of Black femininity, particularly in relation to reality TV. I wonder how you entered into reality TV as a subject matter for your work. It seems like you also engage with it a lot today.
How did I think reality TV became a very random entry point into my work. I grew up watching it a lot. I've always liked women who other people sometimes deem as salacious or fast, and attribute negative qualities to these folks sometimes without a warrant. I think reality TV has a lot of those figures, and I'm really attracted to those people as interesting, like, characters in life. I started watching reality TV when I was in high school and was immediately obsessed and hooked. I can explain everybody's storyline, how they're interconnected, and anytime there's a random celebrity that gets connected to someone from reality TV, I can tell you all about the person. When I was getting my M.F.A, I was like, there has to be some reason why I'm so into this, and like there must be some useful reason in my life that this has become so important to me, and I know all this information about these people. I was really interested in the internet and digital culture. There's a deep connection between memes, reality TV, and the internet. I was interested in exploring that. My M.F.A thesis was about reality and just like the notion. There's this French philosopher named Jean Baudrillard who talks about realities and hyper realities or just multiple realities. I got really into that philosophical theory and thinking about other realities like the internet or reality TV. There's particularly this Instagram page called Area Babes, Ashabo Superstars. It's like screenshots from Nigerian Hollywood films, and they're like have these like funny captions over them. She kind of creates her own little reality TV series on Instagram with these memes. I got really interested in this project, and it launched a whole thing into memes and reality TV and blackness and gender. That's how it started to creep into my theoretical work. And sometime at some point I was like, oh, this is like, I like made this thesis for my M.F.A, and then at some point I was like, oh, I should like share this with other people who like can relate to this, not just people at my like weird school. And so I was like, I should make a zine. And so I made this fun cover and then created the zine from that thesis, and was able to do a bunch of talks at different conferences. This was during 2020 and 2021, so a lot of it was virtual, but that was cool because it was like a nice way to interact with people from all over the world about the internet and race and gender, which was really exciting. And so I think that's how reality TV started to creep into different, I mean, it's already in my brain because it's something I grew up with so intimately, but it started to creep into how I think about the world at large more.
I love the fact that you reference memes and reality TV so much so that you named your zine after shaking the table.
Yeah.
So when you were doing all those conferences, did people, like, was it a mix of people who recognized it, or did you have to kind of explain where it came from often?
I think in the zine, I do a lot more setting up of explanation of who characters are and storylines and who people are connected to. A lot of it is inherently embedded in the presentation, but it was cool because even before I would start explaining, people would be like, oh, and yeah, people would make references to things I didn't include in the presentation, their own personal connections and remembrances of these people. So it was always cool to be like, oh yeah, even people who maybe don't realize they're into reality TV are really into reality TV and have all these personal memories with it, especially like a lot of Black women and femmes who found themselves in these characters would often be really excited to talk about that.
When it comes to reality TV, just like with magazines, and I think back in the day you had the ambition of working in print magazine. Do you currently have an ambition to work as a writer or participate as a character? Or?
No, I think I'm way too shy to be on a TV in any way, shape, or form. That would freak me out. Okay. But I would love to intern behind the scenes for a reality TV show, a really wholesome one for like 2 months. I could do that. That could be the closest I get.
Speaking of wholesome, this next question I wanted to ask in relation to Ma's house. Because you mentioned before that you wanted to transform your grandmother's home in Chicago into a communal art space, whether that has a residency or museum aspect. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that ambition and vision?
Yeah, it's still a forming vision. It's been on my mind for a few years now, but it's just now taking a total formation. My grandma, I call her Mama Betty. It's funny to me that this is called like Ma's house because I would always be like, yeah, we're going to Mama Betty's house. So it's cool when people have that association with people and homes in that way. I was working on a few different house projects or projects that are in houses or places where people lived. One was the Southside Community Arts Center in Chicago. It's one of the first Black art museums allegedly. Or it's the first Black American art museum allegedly. And it's used to be a boarding house, but also like an art center where people could take classes, a gallery. It's still existing today as a gallery primarily. But the person who discovered it is Margaret Burroughs. She's a really cool artist from Chicago. And she discovered when she was in her 20s, and then she went on to discover the DeSabe Museum, which was initially in her house, in her living room. I've been really interested in these spaces that are places where people live, but are also public arts institutions. Recently, I worked with the Henry O. Tanner House in North Philly. Henry O. Tanner was a popular artist, and he was one of the first Black painters to gain international fame. His house is in North Philly, and it's in disrepair right now. There's a group called the Friends of the Tanner House who are doing some work to help renovate it and restore it, and I did this project with them to get community knowledge about how to restore the house creatively. From working with those spaces, I've gotten really into this notion of like, what does it mean to have a house that's an art space? Like, what does that do for people who like are, I don't know, constantly displaced racially? Artists, I feel like especially, have constant issues with housing crisis. I'm really interested in what that means historically, especially for Black folks. I was just wondering what happens to my grandma's house when
she passes on in its simplest form, just like who will like caretake it. And I feel like it's such a beautiful home in this beautiful neighborhood that me and my family grew up in. And I was just like concerned for a house and thought that was like really interesting. And there's another museum in Philly called the Colored Girls Museum, and it was like almost being put up for being closed. And it's a house museum, another house museum, and I thought it was so interesting that the notion of just people mourning a house, creative space, yes, but also a house where people live, and I'm just really interested in that. And so I'm hoping to be able to turn my grandmother's house into a arts institution. Switch works for the Chicago Park districts. My dad has worked at this park nearby for a really long time where I first started taking art classes. I'm hoping to build a connection with the park and the house so people can like have residents, particularly people who are educators and artists. My grandma is a principal, or was a principal, and an English teacher. My aunt's an educator. My mom's an educator. Come from a big education family. Hoping to have artists and educators come through and like do residencies, do classes, workshops. There's some schools that are nearby, and hoping to work with like kids. So just hoping to create some like, I don't know, cool communal space in Chicago where artists can come and get restored. We have a really nice backyard and a garden that my grandma and great grandma attended to for a really long time. So hoping to have people be able to engage with like garden space, farming, things like that. I don't know, really big ideas that I don't know what to do with yet.
That's so awesome. Yeah, I think it's so much aligned with Ma's house, like family history and preservation. But I think with your project, what's interesting is your grandmother is still alive. Started Ma's house like 20 years after she passed away. Yeah. So I wonder what your grandmother's input is in terms of designing space or programs or what should be on the walls. Did you have that conversation?
Yeah, so we have this wall at my grandma's house, and it's everyone's graduation photos. Education's super important to her. She made sure all her kids went to college, and then beyond college, like got graduate degrees. She's really proud that all her kids did that. And so all of our degrees and photos of us graduating on this wall, she's always super proud to show it off. And it has everyone's like from kindergarten all the way until whatever PhD photo, and she's super proud to show it off, like, look at all my kids, they all went to school. It has been one thing that's really important in this house is this wall of everyone's graduation photos that has to always stay up. She recently got the house repainted and had to take all the photos off the wall. And she was like, I don't really want to take the graduation photos down. And when she had the people, she just like also had a fall recently. So she hasn't been able to like move as quickly. But the first thing she did after they painted was put up these photos again. We were like, that's really dangerous. It showed that it was really important to her to see that in her house.
That's so impactful and such a great memory. Yeah, definitely give out diplomas for participating artists and keep that tradition up.
Yes, exactly.
That's really wonderful. I wanted to shout out your podcast, Something You Can Feel. I wonder what inspired you embarking on a podcast, and what are some of the themes that you discuss on there?
What made me start a podcast? I feel like I have random essays in my head about things I see artistically. I need a place to get these out, and then I often send voice notes to my friends, or my friends send voice notes to me, and I feel like I have to respond with voice notes. A couple friends were like, you should start a podcast. You have a really good podcast voice. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but I think other people just was like, yeah, I can like see you starting a podcast. I was like, I'll do it. It was more of other people encouraged it, and then I did have ideas, so I was like, okay, this is something I can do. It was a way of putting myself out there that was definitely different. The podcast is kind of about very random things of Black art history. It goes from all over the place. The first episode is actually not even a Black artist, but it's about artist who pretends to be a Black woman and like goes really far and gets to the Whitney Biennial with that. So it's about race, just in some really broad ways related to art history. The last episode was about Emmett Till and how his death inspired the Twilight Zone, and about this white artist who painted Emmett Till, also doing the Whitney Biennial and controversy surrounding that. So yeah, it kind of just goes all across the board. The main thing that's fun for me is inviting people. I just invite random friends who don't know anything about art history and feel intimidated by it to just talk about things. It's nice to find a new way to bond with friends over something that's kind of nerdy to me. I just started a PhD program in art history, so I'm doing a lot of research again, and in that it's really exciting to think about the podcast in that way related to school stuff. So yeah,
well, you definitely have a podcast voice. I did want to say, I'm gonna shout out the title again. It's Something You Can Feel podcast. I'm gonna binge listen later. Do you ever feel the bravery or the feeling comfortable criticizing what you see in museums when you go to different spaces as part of the podcast, or is it more philosophy behind work that has been in art history? Or
I recently started a part of the podcast where I went into stuff I saw at a museum and kind of critiqued it, but it's also just philosophy behind different artworks and how we get to a point where people are making certain artworks. It's a little all over the place. Anything related to art history is it goes any random place. I did one about Black and Palestinian solidarity, and invited 2 friends who aren't Black, who are just printmakers who are interested in Palestinian freedom and liberation. And it was interesting to talk to them about printmaking and design. So yeah, it kind of goes all over the place.
You mentioned your PhD program at the University of Delaware. In honoring your grandmother's vision for her grandchildren. What are you going on to research, and how does it relate to your current practice?
So I'm researching Black house museums, institutions where Black people have lived and taken up as domestic spaces, but also have treated as public arts institutions, galleries, or places where people have taught workshops, things like that. How does that relate to my practice? It's hard to put my finger on it exactly. I think it relates to my practice because I'm hoping to turn my grandmother's house into that kind of space. But it's hard to figure out. It feels like there's some easy way in which these things all relate, even to the jets and finding them in my grandmother's home. It feels like they're like cousins that hold hands. But it's hard for me to always put my finger on. I'm like, how exactly does this relate to everything else I do? I don't totally know, but it feels like it's obvious.
Well, I was going to say, when I started Ma's house, I thought pretty early on, I'd finally have a studio space to work, but it's still not there. What is your immediate desire with your grandmother's home as a space? Do you hope to have a studio space, or space for creative minds to assemble, or space to show work that has already been created? What's your priority?
I think for me, it'd be a little history of my family. I have a really sweet family, really cool people, really accomplished people. I'd love to create some kind of permanent installation that was a dedication to my family. In the next few years, my grandma is going to be moving out of that house. And so I'd be interested in using it. I have a friend, I'm going to shout out my friend Tia. She has this space called the Tea House Collective. It's her house in Chicago that she's a ceramicist. She rents it out as a studio space to people. Has a similar artist in residency program that she tries to start amongst our friends, essentially. And she does ceramics lessons out of the basement, and it's a really cool space. I'm hoping to borrow some ideas from her about having it be a just cool studio space in the immediate future. And yeah, I think studio space I'm hoping to move back to Chicago sometime in the next few years, and some studio space would be nice. She has that.
Okay. We'll definitely have to visit once it's up and running.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask, was there anything that you wanted to mention, any exciting things? I know you're going into your PhD program, but any exhibits or projects that you wanted to also mention?
I'll say again that I'm looking for Beauty of the Weeks to interview. I've applied to some grants to do that work. If anyone is a former Beauty of the Week or knows a former Beauty of the Week, they should reach out to me.
Maybe just for clarity, when you saw those in Jet magazine, did it have their full name, or how did you do the research to find them?
So you could usually get the name, not a full name. I do a lot of digging on YouTube and Instagram. A lot of them went on to be models of some sort, or local celebrities, and made other accomplishments. So it's kind of easy to Google Jet Beauty of the Week, and some article will pop up about a blog about a woman. like, here's my Jet Beauty of the Week experience, things like that. So it's easy to find from like YouTubing and blog searching and Instagram. It feels like a weird stalker endeavor, but it's strange the way you stumble upon them.
That's amazing hearing about all your projects and how much you're amassing in terms of research and future projects and all the voice memos. So seems like your PhD is just typing all that out.
Yeah, it's just putting that all together somehow.
Thanks again for participating in the Moss House residency and joining us on the Moss House podcast. Any last things you wanted to share?
This was a great time. I'm really grateful. This was a fantastic experience, beautiful space. Really grateful that I could be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.